Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. For those of you who have joined us remotely, it's 34 degrees in Melbourne and very warm. There's 75 people here in Mulgrave at our office at Garratt Publishing, I beg your pardon, and hopefully we are not going to get too warm. So thank you all for being involved. Those that are here, thank you for coming, and those that have joined us online, thank you. This is our annual Advent Luncheon, and for many years it's been only available to the few that are close to us here in Mulgrave, and through technology we're pleased to make it available globally, really. And this is the second time we've tried this. It worked a couple of weeks ago and worked well for those watching away from us. So we hope that we have a glitch-free presentation today as well. We are very pleased today to have Bishop Geoffrey Robinson join us, and in the climate that the media and the goings on at the church, I'm sure there are many questions that people would like to ask Bishop Robinson about the state of the church and abuse and the things that are in the news. And I'm sure he will answer those questions, but we are here really to introduce the Gospel of Luke today. The new lectionary will start with Advent, and Bishop Robinson will talk on that for about 40 minutes and then take questions after on, I'm sure, any topic that you like. He's probably best known for his book Confronting Power and Sex in the Catholic Church, and wow, if that book had been published in the last couple of weeks, it would have been very relevant. However, it's still relevant and has sold very well all over the world. His latest book, The Gospel of Luke for Meditation and Homilies, is very relevant to what we're talking about today, and a great resource for everybody for the coming year when looking at Luke's Gospel. I don't know whether I really need to introduce Bishop Robinson any more than that, except that he does have degrees in theology, philosophy and canon law, and knows his stuff. So please make welcome Bishop Geoffrey Robinson.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for your presence here today. Yes, we're going to talk about the Gospel of Luke, and it's a good thing to do precisely in the middle of all the talk of royal commissions and abuse. It's good to remind ourselves that my faith is faith in a person and a story. The person of Jesus Christ, the story of his life, his death, his resurrection. And that's what my faith is all about. From it flow other things, truths that I believe, moral rules that I seek to follow, a worship that I want to give to God, a community I want to belong to. But take the person and the story away, and the truths become lifeless. The moral rules become burdensome tasks. The worship becomes empty, and the community becomes an institution. Put the person and the story back at the middle, and the truths come alive. The moral rules are the most natural things in the world. The worship is life-giving, and the community becomes a supportive group that I belong to. But only if we put the person and the story back at the centre. And so precisely at a time of turmoil and trouble like this, it's good to remind ourselves of this. It's really why I wrote the book. I was involved with all those other things, and for my own sake, I needed to come back to what I really believe, what's primary for me, and what ultimately is rather secondary to, the mess that the church might get itself into. But Jesus Christ stands there forever. I'm not going to try and take you through the whole of the Gospel, needless to say. Just to give you the briefest outline of Luke's Gospel, he has his infancy narrative. You're all familiar with that, the Christmas story that we find in Luke. Then he has a whole section of about 8 chapters 7 chapters, in which it's the ministry in Galilee. And there he basically takes the Gospel of Mark, most of the scenes from Mark, and rewrites them, putting in his own emphases and priorities, but they're by and large taken from Mark. Then suddenly at chapter 9 verse 50, he has Jesus start a journey from Galilee to Jerusalem. And for 10 chapters we have this journey, and not one word of it is taken from either Mark or Matthew. It's all original Lucan material, this famous journey. And then at the end of it he reaches Jerusalem, and then we have the story of the passion, the death, the resurrection. So in briefest summary, that's the structure of Luke's Gospel. Now all I'm going to do today is take a couple of scenes, one in particular, and try to do something of what I've called at the beginning here a LectioDivina, literally a divine reading of that passage. There are 4 scenes in which Luke, quite deliberately, presents what we'd have to call an over-the-top God, a God who acts, almost would say imprudently, really over the top. Take the first one. It's be ready for whatever comes, dressed for action and with your lamps lit, like servants who are waiting for their master to come back from a wedding feast. When he comes and knocks, they will open the door for him at once. How happy are those servants whose master finds them awake and ready when he returns. I tell you, he will take off his coat, ask them to sit down, and will wait on them. Just a minute. In ancient times, no master ever dreamed of doing that. He'd just come back from a wedding feast late at night, and what? He sits the servants down and waits on them? Never would that have happened. It's the first of what I call this over-the-top God. A God so loving that he would act in this, almost impossible way. Just occasionally today some famous figure might do it, but often they'd also make sure the television cameras were there to see them doing it. But in ancient times it would never ever have happened. So it's the first of these passages. Then there's 2 that go together, the story of the lost sheep and the lost coin. The lost sheep, the shepherd's out with 100 sheep, one of them goes astray. And it says he would leave the 99 there and go off and find it, the 100th, and then he'd put it over his shoulders and carry it back, and he'd call all the other shepherds and rejoice. And commentators say, well, just a minute. While he's gone, wolves would come, thieves would come, and he might find nothing left when he got back. So this is not how any prudent shepherd would react. Even more, the lost coin. A woman who had 10 silver coins lost one of them. What does she do? She lights a lamp, sweeps her house, and looks carefully everywhere until she finds it. When she finds it, she calls her friends and neighbours together and says to them, I'm so happy I found the coin I lost. Let us celebrate. Now, you've all lost coins. Do you do that? And if you brought all your friends in to celebrate, the cost would be a lot more than the coin that you'd lost and found. So again, can you see this over-the-top God, this almost imprudent God, loving so much that they would act in these exaggerated ways? Then, immediately after, we get those 2 parables, and then immediately after, we get the great parable of this, namely the story that's usually called the parable of the Prodigal Son. Let me just go through it to remind you of a few things and perhaps to add a few insights. This man has a property and he has 2 sons, and one's working away all the time. The other's, no, there's nothing going on. It's too boring. He wants to go off to the city, to the bright lights. So he demands half his share, his half of the property. The father was under no obligation to give it to him. In fact, commentators would say that 99% at least of fathers would say, no, you work here and then, when I die the property will be divided, and that's it, end of story. But this father, the son's continually complaining, and he says, he's so unhappy here. So he does it. He gives him his share. He would not have got a full half, but close to it. The son immediately sells it, gets money, takes that, and goes off to the brightest lights he can find, and wastes the lot. The lot. So it's all lost. Now, in Jewish law, this was a very, very big sin, in many ways. To waste all that money on riotous living for a start, to waste the property that his parents had worked so hard for, perhaps several generations had worked hard for it, and to waste it in that way. Plus another one, there was no social service at the time, no pensions. So children, particularly sons, had a very, very strict obligation to look after their parents in old age. That was most important. This son would not be able to do that. And that was, a really big thing. So we must not underestimate the sin that he has committed. It was really serious. You know what happens just as all the money runs out? A famine comes. And he's reduced finally to looking after the pigs, the unclean animals. So he says he comes to his senses. And then he says, here I am starving, and even the servants in my father's house have food to eat. So I know what I'll do. I'll go home and I'll tell father. And then he prepares a speech. You know how we do when we're a bit afraid of something? He prepares the speech that he's going to give to dad. And it's, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I'm not worthy to be called your son. Now, it's a somewhat self-serving thing. Is he really repentant? Is he really thinking about his parents? Or is he thinking about himself? They've got food, I'm starving. If I go back there and give the proper speech, I might get taken on there at least as a servant. So he prepares this speech. And then he heads home. And you know the story, the father's looking out for him, hoping desperately that the son will come back. And there he is in the distance, and it says this ever so, dignified father runs to meet him. Puts everything aside, embraces him. The son begins the speech, but doesn't get far before the father stops him and calls for the robe to be put on him, a ring on his, all the signs of sonship. So he's being received back, not as a servant, but as a son. And even, extraordinary celebration, they're going to kill the fatted calf and have a big celebration. Then, of course, the brilliant second half of the parable, when the elder son comes in from the 5,000th day in the fields, and there's this rejoicing going on. What's this? The music. And he's told, your brother's come back and your father's having this big celebration. And he's angry. Here I have worked 5,000 days in a row and never once did we have it. Now this thing comes back and look what's happening. And the father comes out and says the crucial words to the understanding of this parable. He says, he complains, and the father says, my son, you are with me always, and all I have is yours. Now, that was literally true. The entire remaining property must go by right to the elder son. The younger son would not get a square centimetre of that property. Why? Because he'd had it already. And the only way the father could give him more was by taking it away from the elder faithful son who'd worked in the fields all those years. That would have been a gross injustice to the elder son, and in order to be loving to his younger son, he would not be unjust to his elder son. Now, I said it's usually called the parable of the prodigal son. I far prefer the parable of the prodigal father and his two conflicted sons, because they are both conflicted. For a start, remember, this parable does not finish. At the end of it, let's ask the questions. The elder son, he was angry that first night, but we're going to judge him on that. What about, after a couple of days, did he say, oh, well, he's me brother, welcome home. In other words, did he change, become reconciled? The younger son, was he truly repentant? Remember, it was self-interest that had brought him. Or did he work on the property? Yes. And then when the famine was over, gather up whatever money he'd been able to get and disappear again back to the city. We're not told. And the most common misunderstanding and misrepresentation of this parable is to say, oh yes, the younger son was truly repentant and all the better for the experience he'd been through, while that elder brother was hard and bitter and... Well, we don't know that. That's not there in the parable Jesus taught. He deliberately ends it with a question, with an open situation, where perhaps the younger son was sincere, perhaps he really changed, but we don't know. Perhaps the elder brother stayed bitter, perhaps he changed, we don't know. And deliberately, can you see, we can put ourselves into all three of them. I can see myself as the younger son, sometimes repentant, sometimes self-serving in that, sometimes sincere, sometimes it lasts, sometimes it doesn't. I can put myself into the position of the elder son and think of how I might respond to other people, and I can always put myself into the position of the father. There's only one unambiguous person in this parable, namely the father. The two sons are both, as I've said, conflicted, contrasting things going on within them, and we're not told which way they would go. Okay, with this much background, let's move to LectioDivina. Now, LectioDivina is something in 4 stages. It's a way of reading the scriptures, and the beauty of it is, of this sort of prayer, it actually gives God a chance to talk to us. Whereas most of our prayers, if we're not careful, can be all me talking to God. My words. In fact, a lot of people think that whatever else, you can't have silence. Like in a conversation with someone, silences get sound awkward. So we've got to talk. But this sort of prayer can allow God to talk to me. So the first stage is Lectio, where we read a passage from the scriptures very slowly and reflectively, pausing over every significant word and phrase, so that the word sinks into us. Now, in this particular parable, I won't go through this a lot, but just a bit. There was once a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to him, "Father, give me my share of the property now." Okay, we can stop and think about that situation. A younger son, bored by this country life, wants to go to the city. We can think of that. So the man divided his property between his 2 sons. After a few days, the younger son sold his part of the property, left home with the money, went to a country far away where he wasted his money in reckless living. And we can stop and we can think about that. Spent everything he had, severe famine came, he ends up with the pigs, and we can stop and think about that. Then the next little sub-scene, where he realizes, comes to his senses and said, all my father's hired workers have more than they can eat, and here I am about to starve. So we can think of that scene where he thinks about it and then prepares his speech. Then we can think of the scene where the father sees him in the distance and actually runs to meet him, embraces him, treats him as a son. Do you see what I mean? We stop again and again over every significant little bit, and we think about it. LectioDivina takes time. So more time than I am giving and running through it like this. But we're talking about the methodology of it. Then you go through the whole thing like that. That's the first part of this. It's the lectio, the reading of the thing. The second stage is meditatio, meditation or reflection, where we think about the text we've chosen. And that's where I suggest that reading, say, this book or some other book on Luke's Gospel comes in, where we seek to understand the text. Some of the things I've said today about Jewish law at the time, the expectation that the son would look after parents, all of this, any of those things that we talked about. And that's where this book would come in the ideas, I hope, that it gives for this meditatio part of it. And some of the things that I've got there in terms of suggestions for meditation. God both loves and forgives without ambiguity or reservation. The overwhelming forgiveness of God is far, far above the forgiveness that human beings dole out to one another in small and measured doses. And this is the central message of the parable, and it comes before everything else. So it's a story of God's love and forgiveness before all else. So many human actions are ambiguous. So many human motives are mixed, including mine. Why do we do things? And rarely is it one single motive. All sorts of things come in, good ones and less noble ones. They all come in together. Do we have an appreciation of this ambiguity, both within ourselves and within others? Are we too prone to demand simple, sweeping answers and to make absolute judgments? Can we even manage to be both the older and the younger son at the same time, shallow in our repentance for our own sins and yet quick to judge others? Can we let our own sense of dignity get in the way of love, as the father would not let his sense of dignity get, but ran to meet his son? I've said that the older son is a symbol of many community responses to those with whom the majority disagrees. The elder son was only doing what 99% of the time the people at the time would have done. Most fathers, 99%, would not have taken the son back, and the 1% who would have insisted he come as a servant. Would not have taken him as a son. Again, this is an over-the-top father. Can we, for example, hear the voice of the elder son in the debates about, for example, asylum seekers? Do we react to them like the elder son or like the father? Global warming, law and order, these things where it's very easy to give sweeping, definite answers, no ambiguity at all. The older son is following community standards, and it's the father who has the greatness to break away from those standards. Part of the greatness of this parable is that the father combines mercy to his younger son with justice to his elder son. For individuals, parents and communities, but perhaps especially parents, combining justice and love to all your children is a very difficult task, as I think any parent knows, to be both just and loving and to get a balance between the two. Every school teacher knows it. It really is difficult. We tend to veer from one to the other in different circumstances. So here we're merciful, there we're just. But we rarely get the balance between the two. And this balance between mercy and justice deserves much meditation. And it's one of the greatnesses of this parable. It's the only parable I know that deals with that question of balancing justice and mercy. And it's a very powerful parable on that thing. Sins can be forgiven, but they can leave their effects. Forgiving the sins of others can still leave us with the obligation of ensuring that the offence does not happen again. If a treasurer admits to stealing from the society, the offence may be forgiven, but the person will not be appointed treasurer again, not if they've stolen from there. So, repentance and appointing a person again are not one and the same thing at all. To be restored to the exact position we had before is not an essential element of forgiveness. Forgiveness concerns past actions, while appointments to positions concern the future. Think, for example, of the consequences of sexual abuse. And the wrong done there was appointing the person back to a position of trust again. Whereas the message of this parable is actions have permanent effects. And the father could only treat each of his sons in the situation he had created for himself. They created the situation. The elder brother by working away day after day, the younger son by insisting on his money and wasting it. Each created a circumstance, and the father could only love them in the circumstance they'd created. He could not change those circumstances. And sometimes this definitely means you cannot give a person back the position they had before. Property belongs to men, so this parable is presented in terms of men. Sorry, it belonged, past tense, to men in the world of Jesus. But meditation can extend to where the mother and his sisters, and indeed any wives of the two brothers, fitted into this story. So this is the idea, this is what we do in the meditatio section. We ask ourselves questions, and that's where this book seeks to help by asking the kinds of questions I've just asked, so that we try to meditate on that sort of thing. The third stage is oratio, prayer or response. So we've had lectio, reading, meditatio, meditation, oratio, prayer or response, where we leave our thinking aside and simply let our hearts speak to God. Now here, for example, in this parable, what we might do in the prayer is in turn put ourselves in the position of the younger son, the elder son, the father, and let our prayer come out of that. My response to God, coming out of thinking about each of those three in turn. And then finally, the fourth one is contemplatio, contemplation, where we simply rest in the Word of God. That is, we listen at the deepest level of our being to God who speaks within us. And as we listen, hopefully, we are gradually transformed from within so that the Word has its effect on the way we live. What might we do at that stage? We try our best to be beyond words now. We're not thinking of this word or that word from the story. We're thinking of the overall thing the parables had on us. And may I suggest that there, I'd simply try to rest in this thought. God's unambiguous, over-the-top love and our ambiguity. And just let that, somehow even without words, speak to me, because that's what the parable finally comes down to. An unambiguous God, an over-the-top God, and ambiguous humanity, working out of mixed motives and getting astray here or there in the process, and hopefully not going too far, hopefully able to change back to where they were before. Okay, that's the basic concept. Can I take a question or two on that, and then we'll go to the more general questions. So for now, please, just questions about this parable, about what the understanding of LectioDivina. Can you see that I'm recommending LectioDivina? It's not something for monks in monasteries or people on mountaintops. It's for you, every one of you. It can be done, and it's a beautiful prayer. It lets God speak to me, which is so important in prayer. And that's this book, it's put as an aid, something that might help you in that process. Any questions about that parable or about the process of LectioDivina? Yes? What sort of a time frame do we need for that sort of? Well, up to you. I mean, I can't give you, a parable like that, so rich. Oh gosh, you can spend days and weeks on that, one way or another, can't you? It's almost endless, some of those questions that were asked. But you're not going to have days and weeks to do everything you want to do. You may do it more briefly. It doesn't have to be in one session, so that you could start with this, and then come back to it, at another time. And I'd prefer you did that rather than say, well, done that parable, now I move on to the next one. The aim is to go from more and more words to fewer and fewer words until finally, hopefully, it's just myself and God and we don't need words. That sort of companionship you can have, say, with a husband or wife, or with a really good friend, where silences are not awkward. You can just be together, and no one's going to accuse the other of not talking to them or something. It's an intimacy, and if we can have that with God, if we can get to the stage without words, great. So I tend to say, don't be afraid to come back over something you've already started on. Don't think that there are so many scenes in this gospel. I'll do one today and one tomorrow. One, if you want to, yes, but I'd prefer you to spend time and go to somewhat deeper rather than go over all of them quickly. Yes.
There's something else. I find it also very enriching when a number of people do it together.
Yes.
Rather than just individual.
Absolutely. This is, thank you for that, because quite obviously this is not something you have to do alone. And it can be great to do it with a group of people where different thoughts, and you get a greater richness out of it that way. So thank you. That's a very, very important consideration.
I just love LectioDivina. But my point today is, I'm sitting here living in this era. If that came up in my family, my husband and I would have been talking about it. And there's no woman in that world.
That's why I asked it. I know there isn't. But you see, it's about property, and unfortunately, Jesus had to address this. Property belonged to men. Women couldn't own property. They in so many ways, they didn't have full personhood.
But there was more given away than just the property. It was the freedom. What the Father gave the Son was freedom.
Yeah.
No, the Son took it.
Well, the Son took the property and used it for freedom rather than for anything constructive. He used it destructively, all in every which way.
The Father gave him the decision, choice.
Yes, the Son was demanding the choice, constantly wanting his share of the property now. That word's there, now. And the Father finally gave in. Again, as I said, 99% of fathers would not have done that. It's this over-the-top element that's coming in there already, and he's doing that. And yes, that's why I asked that very last question. This is all in terms of men, because that was the world of then. But what about the mother? What about the sisters? What about the wives, if there were any? Yes.
In a society now where primogeniture is no longer preeminent, would you see that story now being one of highlighting sibling rivalry, craving the love of in the story, the love of the father, the love of the parent, desire to be the favourite in their eyes?
I'd need to think about that. I didn't myself see sibling rivalry in it. I saw it as, just two different sons who chose different courses. One wanting his freedom, wanting the bright lights, all of that. The other content to work on the property, realising that one day it would come to him.
Because I've often used that in my own parish with reconciliation rites.
Yeah.
And being the eldest child, the eldest son, the younger siblings are always reap the benefit of parents.
Well, that depends on your point of view. Me, I was the fourth child of 6, and I look at these things slightly differently.
I'm the number 1 of 6, yeah.
Yes.
Another way to use that, which I find is...
Sorry?
Another way to use the parable is with the picture depicted by Henry Allen.
Yeah.
Of the prodigal son.
Yes, he did.
There's 2 or 3 figures, and one of them looks like a woman standing in the background.
Yeah. He's referring to Rembrandt's famous painting in the Hermitage in St. Petersburg. Yes, Rembrandt's is obviously one. For my liking, even Rembrandt gets a little bit much into that idea of the goody-goody young son who's repentant and the bad older son who's harsh. My response to that is no, don't freeze it, as a painting must. Don't freeze it. Give both of them the chance to give a more mature response. Give the elder brother a chance to change. Give the younger son a chance to be sincere in what he's doing. And I think that's what Jesus intended, this unfinished parable. And it's not the only one. Lots of parables are unfinished because they're stories that are meant to be. Parable, by the way, in Greek means thrown alongside. Something you utter a truth and then you throw alongside it this story. And they never end. You can continually apply them. And I can apply them to my life, you apply them to yours, we apply them to the first son and the fourth son, all of that, and it never ends. Yes?
There seems to me also to be nothing stated with regard to the father's position in society. I dare say that his neighbours and peers and so on would have given him a bit of a hard time about what he did.
Yes, indeed. The community would have been fairly harsh towards this father because he is over the top. It goes. That's why I gave you the other parables first. It goes with those other three stories, the two that are immediately before, and in that first one about the master sitting them down and serving, that comes a couple of chapters before. But they're all this theme of the over the top God. Yes.
Just in general terms, any hints on suggestions of which text to actually choose to use for Lectio in the first case?
Well, Tony says, no, this is my book. No, it's entirely up to you. There are various ways. You can go to favourite things by all means, particularly at the start. At some stage you can say, I'll go through Luke's Gospel, as he wrote it, to see if I can see, connections and developments in the story. And a theme that's announced here and taken up again there. So, that's a fine way to do things too. For example, next year is the year of Luke. That's why this is out now. But it gives you a chance to say, okay, next year, when it's the Sunday Gospels in the church, I'll try to do my LectioDivina on Luke. But up to you. We're sort of at that point now. I'm happy to keep going here because there are a number of questions, unless you want to move on to another subject. Yes.
Geoffrey, my wife Frances made a comment on Henry. Frances runs a weekly group on LectioDivina over in Baronia, and sometimes I'm allowed to assist, sometimes I'm allowed to help her. and generally we'll follow those guidelines you're pointing out to us. But one of the little problems we have is we can get distracted by going down side issues, which are fun, and more so when somebody wants the text of Scripture explained to them during LectioDivina. And just touching on it is helpful, but going into it is too big a distraction. Any advice? Well,
this is where I have a problem with some books and what have you on LectioDivina. See, I've just got at the very beginning here just, the briefest possible comment on them. The first stage is Lectio, we read and reflect on, stop at different words. Second stage is meditatio, where we think about the text we've chosen. Now, I can do that just by taking the gospel and thinking about that. My problem with that is that unless I'm prepared to read, something more than that, I can get into quite false ideas, where I just don't understand what I'm reading. And then if my meditation and prayer all follows just on that, so I do see a role, I'm not just defending this book, I do see a role for, trying to go into what, very little of this is totally original to me. I've taken this from scholars, spent a lifetime meditating on these Gospels, going into the exact meaning of this Greek word and all of that. And why shouldn't we learn from them? Why shouldn't that become part of our prayer? And to me it's important. but it does, as you've hinted, carry its danger that I get so caught up in that study that I never quite get back to the prayer. And I have to make sure that doesn't happen. So that's why this book is really so small, because it's simply, as it says, it's for meditation and homilies. Hopefully also a priest giving homilies or a catechist could use a book like this to find something to talk about.
We'll put it to the test, especially the program we follow is we take next Sunday's gospel.
Yeah.
And the group seem to find that very helpful.
That's certainly one way in which a group can do it by taking the Sunday Gospels. You do realise you're jumping a bit there. You're leaving out passages, particularly this year, poor Mark. They jump all over and leave all sorts of things out. They even put 5 weeks of John in the middle. In fact, I think I counted it up. If there are 52 Sundays in the year, and it's the year of Mark, and I think he gets about 30 of them. And the other 20 are all sorts of other things.
Well, the other weeks you just got long service leave or something.
Yeah. Yes.
Do you have a favourite translation?
No, translations are a problem. They're always a problem. What I'd love to see, actually, is someone bring out a really literal translation and publish it. Because I like as much as I possibly can to go back to what Matthew, Mark, Luke and John were saying to me, not what some translation. And they really do, particularly the Jerusalem Bible, which is the one we use in church. It's not strictly a translation. It's called the principle of dynamic equivalence, where you take the Greek text and you take the idea and then you express that idea in fluent modern English. But that presupposes you've understood the idea exactly. And the connections. Can I give just one tiny example? In the Gospel of Mark, 3 times you meet the phrase, a hardening of heart. Now, it's actually even used in modern medicine, sclerocardia. But, a hardening of heart. Now, he draws connections by using it. At first, it's the Pharisees. But then the other 2 times, it's actually the 12 whose hearts were hardened. Now, we lose that entirely in the Jerusalem Bible because the first time it's translated as their eyes were closed, and then the second time some other phrase, but different one. So we don't see the connection. Whereas in the original, it's quite powerful that Jesus is applying to the 12 the words that we use to the Pharisees. It's saying, it's after the miracle of the loaves, and he's saying, it's not just a failure to understand, it's an unwillingness to understand. And it's very powerful applied to the 12. But you lose it if the translation has translated the same words in different ways. So yes, translations are a problem. I generally use the NRSV, the New Revised Standard Version, as being at least closer, and the NRSV tries, as best it can, to be non-sexist. That is, it tries to avoid, the exclusive words, man this, man that. Again, Greek, Hebrew and Latin all have a third word which English doesn't. They have man, woman, and then this other, say in Greek, anthropos, which is a man or a woman. It's either one. And equally in Latin, homo is that. And in Hebrew, the word that applies to either is actually the word Adam. And then there's Ish is the man and Isha is the woman. So they've all got that, whereas we don't in English. German does. Man, Weib, and Mensch. Mensch in the middle. And that's equally a male or a female. So we need a new word in English. I've been telling this to women's groups for years and none of them will take me up. Where it falls down, they all say, oh yes. And then you try to think of a particular word, no matter what you come up with, they all jump on it. And say, no, not that word.
Why don't we just use the original Greek word you were saying? Why could that just be?
Anthropos,
Yeah, why not?
like anthrop. See, yeah, well, I would have no problem with it, but a lot of other people, no, that sounds all foreign. Or I went back to ancient English, where you had, I'm told, I can't swear to this, someone here may know better than I do, but you had what was it now? You had woman, you had feman, and then I think you had human or something like that. But no, they won't go back to that because feman sounds like female, and again, no word you actually come up with will anyone accept. Yes.
Would you suggest using or refraining from using the mass readings of the day for the Lectio?
Oh no, that's another way to go too. Use the readings of that
I
more.
think the Book of Revelation is something that he might know. I don't get much enlightenment.
Well, that's one where I would most definitely suggest that you have a commentary with you. If you don't, you're going to go into pretty weird stuff. If you're just reading the Book of Revelation as it stands, without any understanding of what's behind it, no, you definitely need a commentary to help you there. I mean, equally, some of the books of the Old Testament, for the same reason, Ezekiel and co, you'd need a commentary.
One was just a quick comment about the gender specific. As a teacher and lover of English for a long time, I objected to using the there instead of he or she. But I think more and more have become acceptable, simply because, as you say, there is no other acceptable alternative.
This is our particular problem in English, that we not just have to invent a new word for, like Mensch. We could always adopt the German one, Mensch. But we also need new pronouns. Because our pronouns also agree with the subject, whereas in most of the Romance languages it agrees with the object. And then, you get those weird ones where in Italy the sun is masculine and the moon is feminine. Cross the Alps and you find that the moon is masculine and the sun is feminine. In German, die Sonne and der Mond. So even the sun and the moon change gender when they cross the Alps.
La lune et le soleil. La lune et le soleil.
Yeah, well, the French is the same as the Italian. Yeah, but the German is different. Yeah. Yes.
Not quite relevant, but is there a suggestion that we're getting a new translation of the Lectio?
Yes. Well, I mean, I'm not sorry that we're leaving behind the Jerusalem, because it really does do violence to the original. I know it's a readable English, but any translation is always inexact. I mean, you're not translating just words. You're translating thoughts out of a particular world to another world. And it's been said, every translation is a lie. A polite lie, a well-meaning lie, but still a lie. So it's a really difficult thing to do, and you go one of two ways. You either go for a very readable English, but then you're getting a long way away from what you're translating, or you go for something more literal, but then it's harder to read. So you've got to strike a balance between the two. They're having problems with the NRSV. They said to them that they were willing to take it, but this is the Catholic Church, but they were demanding a lot of changes. And apparently so many that the NRSV people jacked up and said, no, we won't do that. So now they're looking at some other translation. Huh? ESV, whatever that is. Yeah, anyway, they're looking at that one now. So don't ask me what or when.
Are you happy to take other questions?
Yes, we can take other questions, whatever you wish.
Are there any other comments or questions on other matters?
So I'd like to say one there for Mike. Vatican II and every Pope since has supported the importance of synods in the Church.
Yes.
The Church actually engaging with the people in the Church. There seems to be, despite even Benedict, our present Pope, has come out talking about new hierarchical structures. The last synod in Melbourne was in 1916, and there's a considerable reluctance to have another one, but that's pretty common throughout the world. Have you got a view on why this would be? Why bishops, have something to do with the control from the Vatican?
No.
Fear of heading in a different direction, or fear of the views of the people?
A variety of things. The synod, to me, is a bit too structured. In the code, it's got, these are the people who shall be present, And those who've had something have said, well, I want something a bit freer. And particularly the best synod that I know of was the one they had in Canberra, Goulburn, under Archbishop Frank Carroll. And he simply wanted more lay people present than were possible under the synod structure. Now, I'm totally in favour of that, of what he did. But he didn't, as a result, follow the strict synod one. And so in other words, the reasons can be varied, and some of the ones I can, agree with. I suppose the question now is the timing. I know you're proposing the idea of a synod and even of a new provincial council, and it's even longer since we had one of those. But I would suggest that absolutely nothing can be done now until the Royal Commission's over. Anything done before then would be a waste of time to me. You've got to see. Then, I think, when that comes and we get the recommendations, then I would most strongly favour not necessarily a synod because I'd probably find it too constrictive. Not necessarily a plenary council because I'd find it too constrictive. But some form of very widespread consultation that involved a whole lot of people. I mean, the way I put it is that on that issue, the bishops have quite simply, worldwide, lost credibility. And only the laity can give them back credibility. So they absolutely need the laity in responding to abuse. And that surely has become the question right now for the Church. Some of the other structures are necessary as a means of doing that. But that's the big one. And I've said that, for example, the recent synod they had in Rome on evangelization, forget it. Nobody's listening. If you want to, first fix up the mess of sexual abuse, then talk about, but in the meantime, forget it. Nobody's listening. Yes?
Do you have any thoughts on priestly formation or ways of priestly formation? Not so much in opposition, but as an alternative to the current seminary system?
Yeah, I've come more and more against the present seminary. My problems is it's still a taking people out of the world into this artificial environment, sort of hothouse environment. There was a classmate of mine. He was a carpenter. He'd worked for a number of years before he entered the seminary. He was and he was a very good friend of mine. He died some years ago, but I'll never forget a phrase he used. He said, "I entered the seminary a man, I came out a boy." Gee, that's a devastating comment, isn't it? But you know what I mean. Yeah, and any priest here, anybody who's anything to do with seminaries knows exactly what I mean. So true. Because it was artificial. And I remember at Manly when they first introduced, they had the faculty of theology there, and when we first started having lay students, and some of the seminarians would crack a seminary joke, and it would fall like a lump of lead on the floor once you got people from outside, there with it. It was just... So I'm against that totally hothouse environment. Also because it seemed to me, more and more I think about it, a whole lot of it had to do with celibacy, and we had to take them away from any place where there were women. Because if we didn't, they'd all lose their vocations. All that sort of thinking. Plus my other big objection to seminaries, that to this day, too many of them are still about theological and spiritual preparation. And they're not about the development of the human being. Now, I've long believed if you want a good priest, first find a good Christian. And if you want a good Christian, first find a good human being. But you cannot build a good priest on a poor human being. You've got to have the first one. Even with, sexual abuse. My God, if we'd had half-decent human beings, they couldn't have gone and done all the things they've done. I think the far better way to do that is by, going to a university of some kind. It can be a Catholic university if you like, but at least meeting a broad spectrum of people, doing your theology, your studies there. I'd be in favour of the pastoral year or more where you lived in a presbytery and, worked in a parish so that you at least knew. I mean, I don't know about you, but I had nothing of that. So, yeah, well, you were lucky. I'm before you, obviously, by a long way. But that's a nice compliment I'm making. So. Well, it's pretty obvious. But we had nothing of that. We did all our studies, got ordained, and then into a parish. And boy, was it and there were none of the, the helps that one of the things that I'm about now in another book I'm writing is more professionalism among priests. And all sorts of things. The one I'm particularly thinking of at the moment is having a supervisor. I mean, when I was my first year in a parish, hadn't been there long. I'll give you 2 incidents. A couple came to see me. They wanted to adopt a child from a Catholic agency. And I talked with them, and I very quickly discovered that they're having real problems in their marriage and thought that having a baby would save their marriage. Now, even as a young priest wet behind the ears, I knew that was not good. But I needed a supervisor, someone I could go to and say, this is what they said, this is how I responded. In other words, talk it through so I'd learn from it. And then a few months later, one Saturday morning, I suddenly got a phone call from a doctor, a woman. She was down at a house where a baby had just died a cot death. And she asked me to come down because they were Catholics. So I went down. My God, I'll never forget that morning. Really, I remember it once. Someone, I think the doctor had called the undertaker. And the undertaker came, and at one stage the undertaker tried to take the baby out quietly. But the mother saw him and screamed at the top of the voice, "They're taking away my baby." And I'll never forget that. And I needed someone to debrief with, to talk it over with, all that sort of thing. So, yes, we've got to look to the human development of, all this side of things. And we've got to put in a lot of this increase in professionalism. Things like, a proper psych report before you go in. Careful about it, whoever gets to see it, etc. But, you've got to have it. Better kind of seminary, not the hothouse stuff any longer. And a proper appraisal every 5 to 6 years. In service, obligatory in service. All this. I mean, I've heard sermons that reflected a biblical understanding of 50 years ago. I've heard other sermons that the Second Vatican Council might not have occurred. Now, people deserve better than that. So we've got to have a lot of these things.
Can I just talk of the elephant in the room?
Sorry?
Of the elephant
yes,
in
yes,
the
yes,
room.
yes.
We are talking of the abuse as a separate incident. I think it is all due to the structure we have in the church, the clerical hierarchy that creates most of these problems. Similar to the abuse, I also see finances of the church and also discrimination against sexes. Now, in society today, it is illegal for any organization to discriminate against the person due to age, sex, or whatever. Don't you think that we are only looking at abuse? We are missing the real elephant in the room, which is the authority of the coming down from the Vatican.
I'm currently writing a book called Changing the Culture, and it's looking at all causes of abuse, and it's going into all the different things that contribute.
I think we should pray that with this Royal Commission, we follow on with the other inquiries that will bring the church back into what Vatican II really wanted.
Yeah, I mean, there's a basic problem. This is why I'm writing this book. The Australian bishops cannot change most of the things that need changing.
I'm just a layman, during the Vatican.
Yeah, but can you understand what I'm saying? Yes. The Australian bishops do not have the authority to change the major things that need changing. They can't do the seminary changes we were just talking about. They can't abolish celibacy, obligatory celibacy. They can't ordain women. They can't do, half the absolutely essential things that we've got to do if we are really to respond to sexual abuse. Which is why, the Royal Commission, I'm all in favour of it, but we need more. And that's what I'm trying to achieve.
Can I ask a question? Do sometimes psychological reports or
opinions of theologians get ignored by bishops. I met a guy who was in the seminary in Melbourne for a year or two, and he started talking about some very confidential information, and I thought, how did he get in the first place?
Yeah.
I thought, just because he could pray the rosary, he got in. I thought was he just applying for a job because it was a job?
Look, I can never comment on individual cases because I just don't know the circumstances. So I can't comment on that particular case. No, people should never get hold of psych reports, only those who absolutely need to have them. They should never be made public. And, this is the danger of psych reports. You've got to be very careful how they're used. And you've also got to be careful to assume that people can never change even in small things, so that you use the psych report of 50 years ago and apply it to the, which is pretty unfair. You've got to see what's happened in that person's life over the time. So there are rules about it.
It's also that sometimes I get swayed by the media and I tend to try and stay away from it because I, rely on certain priests for things. But the church has been copying it recently, and one of our radio host down here on ABC, John Fain, says, that he's a journalist and he's got his rules to play by and he can call the shots on his show, but he criticises the church for being what it is. And the police also took a shot at the Catholic Church in the Victorian inquiry for...
can I just make this general comment? Julia Gillard announced the Royal Commission. The very next day, in fact probably that night, the media went on a feeding frenzy of stories where they, in practice, set up their own Royal Commission without a commission and without any rules of evidence. And we've had the most extraordinary... the fact itself exists. There has been abuse, terrible abuse, shocking, sickening abuse on a wide scale. I'm not denying that for 1 second. But bring on the Royal Commission. I'm in favour. Let's have it tomorrow, because then at least we'll have a proper judge using proper rules of evidence and we can assess things. In the meantime, I'm very suspicious of a lot of the comments that journalists are making. So it's not the fact itself. I'm not denying that. I'm just, let's have a proper Royal Commission to deal with these matters, not a media inquiry. I've been judged guilty by the media without their even talking to me, because I was once chairman of Encompass. And they've accused me of, deliberately covering up. Well, I deny that strongly, and let them, one of the most fundamental rules of all court procedures is hear the other side. And if you don't do that, it's a kangaroo court. And yet, I've been called guilty, and no one's ever talked to me. Down the back there first.
If the Catholic bishops, after the Royal Commission, who can do nothing to change the church, can we as laity, can we do something?
Yeah, that's what I'll be talking about later this afternoon, and things that I want to put in place, that I want to do myself. There is still a lot that can be done in Australia. Even in terms of what we mentioned here today, this professionalism of priests. The Australian bishops can do that. They can make it mandatory to have psych reports and a broader selection panel in which you get something of the history of the person and a psych report. They can mandate periodic appraisals, obligatory in-service, supervisors, several other things under that heading. That's all within their power, and I want them to do it. So yes, they can do a certain amount to overcome clericalism. Not entirely, they need a help from the Vatican there too, but something. Other things they can't do. And that's why it's got to be to bring in the Vatican too, and that's my next little job. To try to do something along those lines. But it's premature to try to announce it right now. Over the back.
I was just thinking, when you were speaking there, Bishop, John Paul II's document, Pastores de Lourdes.
Can you speak up?
I was thinking about John Paul II's document, Pastores
Yes.
de Lourdes. And in that, if I remember correctly, he spoke about that there should be 3 forks of formation for priestly ministry: spiritual,
Yes.
The guidelines are already there. How come it hasn't been acted upon?
Well, partly because people haven't listened, that's true, and it is there, but partly because the Vatican is too academic. Their response to that would be to have a course on human development. But, am I right? That's a typical response. Let's have a course on human development. That's not it. You've got to help the individual to grow. In our seminary in Sydney, we did have those things. We had a psychologist on staff, and she worked with each student individually. Now that's beginning to get serious, where you look at each individual and what areas they need to work on and how they might grow. Unfortunately, she was one of the first to be sacked when a certain gentleman from another state came into our diocese. I couldn't help giving that little dig in, yes. Tony, you'll have to call the time.
Look, I just want quickly to go back to the laity bit and what you're saying involving us. We are people of goodwill, but have we been sufficiently educated? How would you choose us?
Personally, I would have a fairly complex system according to which people contributed according to their experience and ability. So it would be different. It wouldn't be everybody exactly the same. I'll give you this much of what I'm in mind. I want to see a new council with the one solitary focus of getting rid of sexual abuse. Not beyond it, keep it focused. And there'll be a number of issues you'd have to raise beyond that. I would want to see it have, the bishops would always be part of it. You can't exclude them. You can't say, well, I'm going to have a council with no bishops in it. That will not happen. But I would like to see 2 lay people for every bishop. Now, how would I choose them? Not willy-nilly. I would look for a start, because they would be dealing with serious theological questions. I would choose people who've done at least 3 years of serious study at a theological faculty. Right? So I'd choose from those. There are plenty of those around now. But you see what I mean? I'm not going to just take Joe Blow from here, and because we're going to be dealing with, things that, what does Scripture say here? What is it, the exact meaning of it? So yes, I'd want people with a good, done studies. Others would have different roles in this. It's a fairly complex thing that I have in mind. But in brief, a role for everybody, but not the same role for everybody.
I have my last question. As a priest, Geoffrey, how have you held up with the latest media and scrutiny?
How have I held up with the latest media and scrutiny? In all honesty, not terribly well. It's been a very difficult couple of weeks, and I've spent several sleepless nights. I just couldn't get to sleep with all this stuff going through my head. I had the job for 9 years, from 1994 to 2003, on the Professional Standards Committee, and for the last 6 years of that I was the chairman of it. So I was in many ways the public face of the church during that time. And I must say at the end of the 9 years I'd had it. Partly because I'd been a victim of abuse myself as a young teenager, and this brought all that up, and I was working through it. And I got some help for the first time in my life at that time, and I was coming to realise all the effects it had had on myself, and that made it really. Now I'm suddenly back in that world. We're in the latest bit. Some media are blaming me for covering up, and naming me as such. The Herald even had my photograph there. Well, if this thing touches you personally, oh boy, it's searing. It's like being, put right next to a furnace. So yes, it's been extraordinarily difficult, and if I could get away from it somehow, I would. Whereas, if the Royal Commission called me, I had no idea whether they will. If they did, I would happily go, and I would answer every question as honestly as I possibly could, and I would conceal nothing. I don't mind a Royal Commission with proper judges and proper rules of evidence. It's this media stuff that I find so difficult. You know, last week I did 2 interviews for the ABC television. I did radio ones, etc. But the two television ones, both times I was interviewed for between 10 and 15 minutes. Both times 10 seconds appeared on TV. You know, that's really... And in one case, I am sure they had written the entire text beforehand, and all they wanted was the little bit where I criticised George. That's all they wanted. Forget the rest. So that's very, very hard indeed.
And I think with that we'll call it time. Thank you all for coming. Thank you all for viewing online. And most importantly, Geoffrey, thank you for your honest and quite insightful look at the Luke of Gospel, Gospel of Luke perhaps, and also your quite honest views on the church today. So please let's make him something that Thank you. I think he's probably one of the most brave people in the country. And I think we need to recognise that. The bravest person, perhaps. Again, all, thank you very much for participating. There is still food and drink. Please hang around. And if you've bought the book, I'm sure Bishop Geoffrey Robinson will be happy to sign it for you as well. We do have a commitment at about 2:30, but between now and then, he'll be available to have a chat to. Thank you.